Hello and welcome to Comparative Literature Analysis 101. Today we are going to look at a much loved song which is underappreciated, as it's actually, in my opinion, one of the most profound works of Western literature. Now, you may know it. Here's how it starts. There's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, a hole. Notice how the composer immediately sets the stage. The thus so far unnamed protagonist is talking to Liza and describing a problem with his bucket, so the stage is set for conflict. So let's move on. Liza replies, "Then mend it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then mend it, dear Henry, dear Henry, mend it." At last our protagonist has a name, Henry, which gives this character a more three-dimensional appearance, so to speak. We also notice that Liza has a somewhat posh accent, so the author sets up the tension caused by class differences and class privilege. Let's move on. How does Henry react to what Liza has to say? He says, "With what shall I mend it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I mend it, dear Liza? With what?" Now, Henry doesn't know how to fix a hole in a bucket. That means he's probably not a bucket person by trade. So he's asking Liza for some assistance. Does Liza assist him? You be the decision maker on that question. "With straw, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With straw, dear Henry, dear Henry, with straw." Now, some of you might be thinking, I don't know that straw is the most appropriate material with which to repair a bucket hole. And so you might think Liza's having him on, but I think there's something more deep at play. I think here the author's veering into sort of surrealistic, absurdist literature in the tradition of Beckett, and possibly even foreshadowing the entire genre of science fiction. Let's listen to Henry's response. "The straw is too long, dear Liza, dear Liza. The straw is too long, dear Liza, too long." So, although Henry didn't realise that straw could be used to fix a bucket hole, he did know that it has to be the right size if you are to use that particular material. And he doesn't know how to make it that size. So Liza replies, "Then cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry, cut it." A very sensible reply, if you ask me. Henry goes, "With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I cut it, dear Liza? With what?" Now, it must be said, at this point, Liza's getting pretty cheesed at Henry, so she's getting exasperated, and she goes, "With a knife, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a knife, dear Henry, dear Henry, a knife." Now, Henry, who didn't know you could use straw to fix a bucket, and he also didn't know once you use said straw how to cut it, he procures a knife from somewhere magically. He has a knife because in the next verse he says, "This knife is too dull, dear Liza, dear Liza. This knife is too dull, dear Liza, too dull." It must be said that straw is not known for being particularly difficult to cut. It's not like you need a 5,000 RPM diamond-tipped circular saw blade to cut through a piece of straw. So one wonders at this point if Henry's having Liza on a little bit, but does she fall for the bait? No, she takes him seriously. Then sharpen it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then sharpen it, dear Henry, sharpen it. Now, Henry knows the knife is too dull, but he doesn't know how to effect a transformation from a dull knife to a sharp knife. So he says to Liza, with what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza? With what? Liza replies, not with a knife sharpener that you can pick up from IKEA for $2 or $10 or whatever it costs. She gives him a more primitive answer. She says, with a stone, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a stone, dear Henry, a stone. Now, Henry doesn't know how to sharpen a knife, but he knows somehow that if you use a stone to sharpen a knife, the stone should be wet. So he says, this stone is too dry, dear Liza, dear Liza. The stone is too dry, dear Liza, too dry. At this point, Liza is really pissed off. I mean, here's Henry bothering her with all the stupid questions in the world. So she says to him, then wet it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then wet it, dear Henry, wet it. And it's at this point that the basic, fundamental obtuseness of the Henry character comes through in the work, because he says, with what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what? Liza replies most naturally, with water, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With water, dear Henry, water. Now, Henry's being a bit crafty here, because he's trying to lead Liza in a certain direction. I don't mean to foreshadow the end of the piece, but just bear with me. So rather than understanding that it's possible to carry the stone to the tap and wet it that way, no. Henry thinks, no, you got to bring the water to the stone. So he says to Liza, in what shall I fetch it, dear Liza, dear Liza? In what shall I fetch it, dear Liza? In what? Now Liza has had enough. She's at the end of her rope. So she says, in a bucket, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. In a bucket, dear Henry, a bucket. And it's at this point that Henry, who we thought was this obtuse, thick idiot, springs his carefully primed trap, because he says to Liza, but there's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, a hole. Now, you might think at this point that, you know, the work would start all over again from the beginning. But in fact it doesn't. And we are left to read the author's intentions into why it stops at this point. And the most convincing theory I've heard is that Liza just blows her gasket and murders Henry at this point with a blunt knife. Or maybe beats him on the head with a stone. I don't know which. You pick your favourite theory. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this analysis of this important piece of Western literature. And perhaps I'll see you next time when we'll take a crack at Michael Finnegan, who had hairs on his chin again.